The changes didn't announce themselves. There was no single moment when the human body became something different, no declaration, no ceremony. Just a slow replacement of what had been ordinary for most of human history with something engineered to behave differently inside living systems. By the time most people noticed, the shift had already become normal. It started with oils. For thousands of years, humans consumed fats that came directly from animals or plants in forms that required minimal processing: butter, lard, olive oil, tallow. These were expensive to produce in large quantities, but they were stable. They had been part of diets across cultures, across centuries, without much controversy. Then, in the early 20th century, a new category of fat entered the food supply. Seed oils, extracted from soybeans, corn, cottonseed, and rapeseed, could be produced at industrial scale. They were cheap, they were abundant, and they required chemical solvents and high heat to extract, a process that had never been used on food before. At first, they were used for things like soap and lamp fuel. Then someone realized they could be sold as food. The marketing was careful. These oils were presented as clean, modern, scientific. They were associated with progress, with health, with moving away from old, outdated habits. Animal fats were reframed as dangerous, artery-clogging, primitive. Most people didn't question it. There was no public debate about whether the human body had evolved to process these oils, no long-term studies, no consideration of what might happen when a population began consuming them daily in quantities far beyond anything that had existed before. They simply became normal. By the 1960s, seed oils were everywhere, in margarine, in salad dressing, in packaged snacks, in restaurant fryers. The average person was consuming them multiple times a day without knowing it because they weren't listed prominently on labels and because there was no reason to think anything had changed. It blended into everyday life. Most people never noticed this at the time. There was no announcement that the fat composition of the average diet had fundamentally shifted. No warning that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, something the human body had maintained within a narrow range for millennia, was now tilting heavily in one direction. Omega-6 fatty acids, which are abundant in seed oils, are essential in small amounts. But in large amounts, they behave differently. They influence inflammation pathways. They alter cell membrane composition. They change the way the body responds to injury, stress, and infection. None of this was discussed openly. The oils were cheap, and they solved a problem for food manufacturers. They extended shelf life. They allowed mass production. They made it possible to create snack foods that could sit in warehouses for months without spoiling. And because they were liquid at room temperature and didn't have a strong flavor, they were easy to hide. People weren't eating seed oils the way they ate butter, spread on toast, visible and deliberate. They were consuming them passively, embedded in foods that didn't taste like oil at all. Crackers, cookies, frozen meals, bread, cereal bars, salad dressings marketed as healthy. The transformation was quiet. By the 1980s, the average American was consuming more than 10 times the amount of omega-6 fatty acids than their great-grandparents had. Most of them had no idea. There was no campaign to inform them, no effort to track what this might mean over decades. It seemed too small to matter back then. At the same time, another shift was happening. Sugar was being added to foods that had never contained it before. Not just desserts, not just candy, but bread, pasta sauce, salad dressing, crackers, yogurt, breakfast cereal, canned vegetables. Even salt had sugar added to it in some formulations to prevent clumping. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was a solution to a problem. When fat was removed from food, because fat had been declared the enemy, the food tasted bland, it didn't satisfy, it didn't sell. So sugar was added. Sometimes it was labeled as sugar, sometimes it was corn syrup, sometimes it was dextrose, maltodextrin, fruit concentrate, evaporated cane juice. The names changed, but the effect was the same. The human body, which had spent most of its evolutionary history in environments where sugar was rare and seasonal, was now encountering it constantly. And not just sugar, but sugar combined with refined flour, which behaves almost identically in the bloodstream. Glucose spikes, insulin surges, the body scrambles to manage the sudden flood of energy. At first, it adapts. The pancreas works harder. The liver stores what it can. Fat cells expand to absorb the excess. But over time, the system begins to wear. Insulin resistance develops slowly. It doesn't announce itself. There's no pain, no visible symptom, just a gradual loss of sensitivity, a dulling of the body's ability to respond to its own signals. By the time it's detectable, it's already been progressing for years. The real impact appeared years later. In the 1970s, obesity rates in the United States were relatively stable. Around 13% of adults were classified as obese. By the year 2000, that number had more than doubled. By 2020, it had nearly tripled. Diabetes followed a similar trajectory. In 1960, less than 1% of the US population had been diagnosed with diabetes. By 2020, that number was over 10%, with millions more in a pre-diabetic state they didn't know about. Heart disease, despite decades of public health campaigns focused on reducing fat intake, remained the leading cause of death. And new patterns began to emerge. Autoimmune conditions, which had been rare, became more common. Inflammatory diseases increased. Rates of anxiety and depression climbed steadily. Fertility issues appeared more frequently. Children began developing conditions that had previously been seen almost exclusively in adults. None of these changes happened overnight. They accumulated gradually across a generation in a way that made them difficult to see clearly. Each individual case seemed isolated. Each diagnosis felt personal, private, unrelated to anyone else's experience. But the patterns were there. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. The foods that had changed didn't look different. Bread still looked like bread. Crackers still looked like crackers. Yogurt still looked like yogurt. But the ingredients had shifted. Where once a loaf of bread might have contained 4 or 5 ingredients, flour, water, salt, and yeast, it now contained 15, 20, sometimes 30 ingredients. Preservatives to extend shelf life, emulsifiers to improve texture, conditioners to speed up production, sugars to enhance flavor, seed oils to reduce cost. Each ingredient had been tested individually and deemed safe. But no one had studied what happened when all of them were consumed together daily for decades. The assumption was that the human body would adapt. And in a way, it did. It adapted by becoming larger, by storing more fat, by increasing baseline inflammation, by recalibrating what normal hunger felt like, by changing the composition of gut bacteria, by altering hormone signaling. These weren't failures of the body. They were responses to an environment that had changed faster than biology could keep up with.
This wasn't the result of individual choices. People didn't wake up one morning and decide to eat more sugar, more seed oils, more refined carbohydrates. They ate what was available, what was affordable, what was marketed to them as healthy. Low-fat yogurt, which was supposed to be good for you, contained more sugar than ice cream. Whole-grain crackers, which were supposed to be wholesome, were made with soybean oil and corn syrup. Frozen dinners, which were supposed to be convenient and balanced, were engineered to be addictive, high in salt, sugar, and fat, in combinations that didn't exist in nature. The choices were designed. Food scientists worked for years to find the bliss point, the precise ratio of sugar, salt, and fat that would make people want to keep eating even after they were full. It wasn't a secret. It was published in industry journals, discussed at conferences, celebrated as innovation. The goal was to increase consumption, and it worked. Between 1970 and 2000, the average American increased their daily caloric intake by more than 500 calories. Most of that increase came from processed foods, from snacks, from beverages, from foods that didn't require cooking, didn't require preparation, didn't require thought. The environment had been redesigned to encourage eating more often, in situations where eating hadn't previously occurred. The body tried to signal when something was wrong. Hunger and satiety are regulated by hormones: leptin, ghrelin, insulin, and peptide YY. These hormones communicate between the gut, the brain, and fat tissue, creating a feedback loop that, under normal conditions, keeps energy balance stable. But that system depends on certain assumptions. It assumes that food will contain fiber, which slows digestion and triggers satiety signals. It assumes that fat will come in forms that require time to break down and absorb. It assumes that sweetness will correlate with caloric density, so the brain can learn to predict energy intake. Processed foods violated all of these assumptions. Fiber was removed to improve texture. Fats were replaced with oils that were absorbed faster. Sweetness was decoupled from calories using artificial sweeteners, confusing the brain's ability to predict energy. The result was a system that no longer knew when to stop. People could eat a full meal and still feel hungry an hour later, not because they lacked willpower, not because they were broken, but because the signals that should have told them they were satisfied had been disrupted. And because the foods were designed to be consumed quickly, without much chewing, without much thought, the brain didn't have time to register fullness before the next portion was already being eaten. By the time the body realized it had consumed too much, the damage was done. Similar decisions followed. The food supply didn't just change in one way. It changed in dozens of ways, all at once, all for similar reasons. Livestock were moved indoors and fed grain instead of grass, changing the fatty acid composition of meat and dairy. Fruits and vegetables were bred for sweetness and shelf life instead of nutrient density. Salt was refined to remove trace minerals. Wheat was hybridized to increase yield, altering its gluten structure and glycemic impact. Each change on its own seemed minor, but together they represented a wholesale transformation of what the human body was expected to process. And because it happened incrementally over decades, there was no reference point. People in 2020 had no memory of what food tasted like in 1950. They had no way to compare. They had no reason to think that anything fundamental had shifted. They just knew they felt different. Tired more often, hungry more often, sick more often. But they didn't connect it to the food, because food was supposed to be safe. It was regulated, inspected, approved by experts. If something were wrong, someone would have said something. But no one did. The regulatory agencies responsible for protecting public health operated on a standard called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. Under this standard, a substance could be added to food if it was generally recognized among experts as safe. The problem was that safe was defined narrowly. It meant the substance wouldn't cause immediate poisoning. It didn't mean the substance had been studied over decades. It didn't mean the substance had been tested in combination with other substances. It didn't mean the substance was safe when consumed daily for a lifetime starting in childhood. And it didn't require the substance to be tested on the populations most vulnerable to harm: pregnant women, infants, children, the elderly, people with chronic illnesses. Once a substance was declared GRAS, it could be added to thousands of products without further oversight. And because the food industry was allowed to self-report, companies could hire their own experts, conduct their own studies, and submit their own conclusions. There was no independent review, no requirement to publish data, no mechanism for the public to know what had been added or why or in what quantities. The system was designed for efficiency, not caution. By the early 2000s, the average American was consuming more than 3,000 chemicals that had been added to food intentionally. Preservatives, colorings, flavorings, texturizers, stabilizers, anti-caking agents, emulsifiers, thickeners. Most of them had never existed before the 20th century. Most of them had been tested only in isolation on animals for short periods. None of them had been tested in the combinations people were actually consuming them. And none of them had been tested on developing bodies, on children whose brains, whose immune systems, whose metabolic systems were still forming. The assumption was that if a chemical didn't cause obvious harm in the short term, it was safe. But harm doesn't always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it takes years to appear. Sometimes it shows up as a slight increase in risk, too small to notice in any individual case, but significant across a population. Sometimes it manifests as a cluster of symptoms that don't fit into any single diagnosis: fatigue, brain fog, digestive issues, joint pain, mood instability. Symptoms that are easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to stress, aging, bad luck. Symptoms that don't seem connected to anything in particular. But when millions of people report the same symptoms at increasing rates across demographics, the pattern becomes harder to ignore.
And this wasn't the only change.